In every era, humankind finds itself circling around the same core questions. Who are we? Why are we here? What does it mean to believe? These are the questions that transcend time, culture, and geography, and within the divine message of the Qur'an, they are answered with clarity, depth, and narrative power. Surah Al-Kahf, the 18th chapter of the Qur'an, is one such gift of guidance. Revealed during the Meccan period of the Prophet Muhammad's mission, it serves not only as a spiritual anchor but also as a lens through which to view the challenges and trials of faith. It is in this chapter that the story of the people of the cave unfolds, a story that, though short in passage, resonates profoundly across time as a parable of belief under pressure, isolation for the sake of truth, and the subtle hand of divine providence. Surah Al-Kahf holds a special place in the hearts of Muslims. It is recommended to be recited every Friday, and not without reason. The Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said that reciting the opening and closing verses of Surah Al-Kahf serves as a protection from the trials of Dajjal, the great deceiver who will appear near the end of time. This alone places the chapter within a framework that stretches far beyond the historical moment of its revelation. Surah Al-Kahf is not merely a recounting of old tales or moral fables. It is a preparation for the tests that come with being a person of belief in a world where truth is often ridiculed, where the righteous are outnumbered, and where the passage of time itself can feel like a burden on the soul. The chapter contains 4 primary stories, each representing a distinct kind of trial. The story of the people of the cave centers on the test of faith, of holding to belief in an environment where disbelief dominates. The story of the owner of the 2 gardens deals with the trial of wealth and the deception of worldly success. The narrative of Musa and Khidr explores the test of knowledge and the humility required to trust divine wisdom even when events seem inscrutable. Finally, the story of Dhul Qarnayn engages with the trial of power, depicting a righteous ruler who uses his authority to protect and serve. Together, these stories form a comprehensive guide to navigating the challenges of life, and they are stitched together by a recurring reminder. All trials are temporary, and all outcomes are within the knowledge and control of Allah. Yet among these stories, the tale of the people of the cave stands apart in its intimacy and in the starkness of its message. It is not a story of armies, nor of prophets, nor of grand miracles in the open. It is a quiet story, told with a few verses and gentle phrasing, about a group of young believers who withdrew from a corrupt society for the sake of their Lord. Their names are not recorded. Their exact number is left vague. Their location is not specified. This absence of detail is not accidental but purposeful, for the story is meant to transcend its setting. It is a story about principle, about the pure act of choosing truth over comfort, belief over conformity, and trust in Allah over the security of the world. The essence of the story begins with youth. Young people, filled with the intensity of belief and the clarity of moral vision, are often the first to challenge falsehood when others grow complacent. These youth saw the idolatry and injustice in their city, and rather than remain complicit, they made a decision that would forever alter the course of their lives. They left everything behind: their families, their comfort, their future, to preserve their faith. It is this act of fleeing, not for political rebellion or material gain, but for the sake of Allah, that becomes the heart of their legacy. Their decision to seek refuge in a cave is telling. The cave is not a palace. It is not a fortress. It is a place of natural seclusion, cold, dark, and inhospitable, and yet it becomes a sanctuary. In entering the cave, they symbolically turn their backs on the world and submit themselves entirely to divine protection. They do not know what will happen next. They do not formulate a grand plan or strategize their survival. They simply ask their Lord to guide them rightly in their situation, and they wait. This complete surrender, this pure reliance on Allah, is what transforms the cave from a hollow space in the rock to a vessel of divine mercy. The miracle that follows their sleep for over 3 centuries is a testament to Allah's power over time. In a world obsessed with the passage of days and the urgency of action, this story turns that notion upside down. Allah places them in sleep, untouched by hunger, time, or fear. The sun shifts in the sky to protect their bodies. They are turned from side to side. Their dog waits faithfully at the entrance. Time ceases to have meaning inside the cave, and in this suspension, a different kind of transformation takes place, not of the body, but of the world outside. When they awaken, everything has changed. The tyranny they fled is gone. The beliefs they were persecuted for are now accepted. The story that began with desperation ends in vindication. But the true lesson lies not in the miracle, nor in the external outcome, but in what the story reveals about faith itself. To believe is to trust beyond what is visible. It is to accept that Allah's wisdom is greater than our perception, and that sometimes isolation is the path to protection. Sometimes being forgotten by the world is the way Allah preserves you. And sometimes sleep itself can be more active than action, if Allah wills it. The story of the cave invites the reader to reflect on the nature of time, on the impermanence of oppression, and on the enduring value of sincerity. It forces us to consider that history does not always move forward in a straight line, that what seems like defeat can be the first step toward legacy, that a group of nameless young men protected in a cave can echo through history as examples of faith unshaken. For the believer today, surrounded by modern forms of idolatry, whether materialism, fame, power, or the elevation of egothist story is not distant, it is profoundly relevant. The cave is not just a physical space but a metaphor for spiritual retreat. Every believer at some point will have to seek their cave, to distance themselves from the world in order to preserve what is sacred within. That cave may be a moment of silence in prayer, a period of reflection, or even a conscious withdrawal from toxic influences. But what matters is the intention. Like the young men, the believer must be willing to let go of worldly guarantees and step into the unknown, trusting that Allah will make a way where there seems to be none. As we begin to walk through this story in more detail, we carry with us the awareness that it is not merely about a group of youth in ancient times. It is about us, our challenges, our doubts, our yearning to hold on to belief in a world that often undermines it. The test of time is not only how long we endure, but how well we remain true. And the test of belief is not only what we claim with our tongues, but what we are willing to sacrifice to uphold it. In this story, belief is not static. It is active. It chooses. It walks away. It waits, and it is rewarded, in ways far beyond what the human eye can imagine. Before the cave was ever a place of refuge, it stood in stark contrast to the world left behind. The city from which the youths fled was one that pulsed with disbelief, arrogance, and tyranny. It was a place where power was enforced not with justice but through fear, and where the hearts of its leaders were hardened against the truth. The people of the city had turned away from the worship of the one Creator, replacing divine guidance with man-made idols and empty rituals. The young men who would later sleep in the cave were not raised in a land of righteousness. They grew up surrounded by voices that mocked the idea of submission to God, in homes where false gods adorned the shelves, and in streets where those who dared to speak of divine unity were silenced. The decision they would eventually make was not born from ease or impulsivity. It was forged slowly, in the silence of reflection and in the weight of conscience. These young men were, by all accounts, part of the city's nobility. They were not outcasts or beggars. Their clothing was fine, their upbringing likely privileged, and their names carried weight in the city's social circles. But with privilege came expectation. They were expected to uphold the traditions of their people, to bow before the gods their fathers had revered, and to join in festivals that celebrated practices they had come to question. What stirred within them was not rebellion for the sake of rebellion, but a longing to find what was real. When they looked up at the stars at night, they felt the pull of something greater. When they witnessed injustice committed in the name of idols, their hearts recoiled. When they heard stories of prophets of old, stories whispered in corners by the few who still remembered, something awakened within them. Their journey into belief was quiet, and perhaps even lonely. It is not easy to question everything you have been taught, especially when you are young, and when everything around you affirms the falsehood. But Allah chooses whom He wills, Their hearts were guided, and with that guidance came courage. One by one, they came to recognize that the world around them was sick, not only in its outward corruption, but in the spiritual rot at its core. They began to seek each other out, drawn by the recognition of shared belief. Perhaps their meetings began with cautious conversation, careful words, and subtle glances to see who else dared to speak the truth. In a land where belief could mean death, such conversations were not undertaken lightly. But Allah brought their hearts together, and in that small group, belief was kindled into flame. They could have remained silent. They could have kept their faith hidden, choosing the path of quiet survival. But the truth has a way of making silence unbearable. Their belief was not something that could be compartmentalized or hidden away. It spilled into their decisions, their demeanor, their refusals to participate in ceremonies, and their absence from public rituals. The more their hearts grew firm in faith, the more their lives became incompatible with the city around them, and the city noticed. What began as whispers soon turned into accusations. How could the sons of nobility turn their backs on tradition? How dare they question the gods that had supposedly protected the people for generations? The threat of punishment loomed, not just social isolation, but the real possibility of persecution, imprisonment, or death. The ruler of the land was a man of power who would not tolerate dissent, especially dissent of a spiritual kind. His throne rested on the illusion of divine favor. To believe in one God was not only a religious statement but a political one. It undermined his authority and shook the foundation of the social order. The youths, now exposed, were summoned. The confrontation was not subtle. They were questioned before the people, pressured to conform, and threatened with consequences if they did not recant. In this moment, they stood firm. With composure and dignity, they declared their belief in the Lord of the heavens and the earth. They refused to attribute partners to him. They did not insult the people or mock their traditions. They simply stated the truth, even though they knew the cost. This act of open declaration, known in Islam as Shahada, was their turning point. It meant they could no longer remain in the city. They would not be allowed to live peacefully with their belief. The path forward was clear, though it was not easy. They would have to flee. This decision was not made lightly. It meant leaving behind everything. Their homes, their families, their comfort, and the familiarity of a life they had always known. They were not warriors. They were not equipped for travel, but they placed their trust in Allah. They knew that protection lay not in walls or weapons, but in faith. They did not know where they would go. They did not have a plan. What they had was conviction. The road out of the city must have been filled with tension. Every sound in the forest, every rustle of leaves, might have been the sound of pursuit, but they pressed on, driven not by fear but by purpose. Their footsteps were heavy, but their hearts were lightened by certainty. Somewhere outside the reach of human tyranny, there had to be a place where they could be alone with their Lord. As they moved away from the city, its noises faded. The chants of idolatry, the laughter of those who mocked them, the clanging of coins in the marketplace, all were left behind. In its place was the silence of nature, the wind over stone, the chirping of distant birds, the dry crunch of gravel beneath their sandals. These were not just the sounds of travel, but of separation, of beginning again. What awaited them was not a kingdom, not an escape into a better society, but a cave, a hollow space carved into rock, a place forgotten by men, exposed to the elements, without comfort or protection. And yet they saw it as a blessing. It was away from the city. It was quiet. It was enough. For them, the cave was not a symbol of defeat, but of choice. It was a place where they could worship without fear, sleep without anxiety, and speak to their Lord without interruption. When they entered the cave, they did so with a heart full of dua, asking their Lord to grant them mercy and guide them rightly in their affair. Their words were simple, but their sincerity was immense. They knew they were nothing without divine assistance. The city they left behind likely continued its rituals, its parades, and its business. The ruler probably scoffed at the loss of a few idealistic youths. But the heavens recorded their names. even if the Qur'an did not. The angels bore witness to their faith, and Allah, in His infinite mercy, chose to make their story eternal. The people of the cave, once exiles, would become examples for generations to come. Their city, powerful and proud, would one day be dust. But their decision to believe, and to act on that belief, would echo in every heart that longs to stand firm in the face of disbelief. In leaving their city, they gained something greater than safety. They gained the favor of their Lord, and in doing so, became a light for others walking through the darkness. The journey into the cave was not a simple matter of fleeing from danger. It was an act shaped by the fire of conviction and the weight of uncertainty. The young men had already turned their hearts away from the comforts of their past lives, but now they had to turn their bodies as well. Leaving the city was the first step, but it was not the hardest. What lay ahead was the complete abandonment of the known world, a stepping into wilderness with no promise of survival, no guiding map, and no companion other than their shared belief in the mercy of God. Every footstep away from the city pressed deeper into the silence of the unknown, and in that silence, their resolve was tested again and again. The land outside the city was rough and unwelcoming. Rocky slopes and patches of dry earth stretched in every direction. The sun bore down without mercy, and the wind offered no comfort. Their clothes, once symbols of youth and status, quickly became heavy with dust and wear. They were not trained travelers or hardened warriors. They were young, still closer to adolescence than manhood, and yet their hearts carried a strength far greater than what their limbs could bear. As they walked, their thoughts no doubt drifted to the lives they had left behind. Perhaps one of them remembered the warmth of his mother's voice, or the smell of bread baking at dawn. Perhaps another thought of a younger sibling who would wake to find his bed empty. They had made a choice to leave it all behind, but that did not mean their hearts were numb. They were human, and faith did not make them immune to longing. Rather, it gave them something stronger than comfort. It gave them purpose. As the distance between them and the city grew, so did the silence. The sound of commerce, shouting, music, and laughter faded until all that remained was the whisper of the wind through scattered brush. There were no familiar paths to follow. They were not heading toward any known village or promised land. They were not guided by maps or caravans. They followed only the instinct to move further from what was false and closer to what felt pure. When they found the cave, it was not a discovery of grandeur. It was not a shining refuge waiting with open arms. It was a shadowed cleft in the side of a barren hill, a hollow space in the rock that might have been missed if not for their desperate search, but in its obscurity, they found a kind of mercy. The entrance to the cave was modest, partially hidden by overgrowth and positioned in such a way that the light of the sun could not fully pierce its depths. From the outside, it appeared cold and lifeless. Inside, it was darker still, and the air carried the scent of damp stone and ancient stillness. Yet none of them hesitated. They entered not because it was comfortable, but because it was necessary. In the cave, they found a boundary between the world they had left behind and the unknown future that awaited them. It became a threshold between fear and surrender. They laid their weary bodies upon the stone, not knowing whether they would ever rise again. They had no food, no shelter beyond the rocky walls, and no company beyond one another. Yet in that moment of complete vulnerability, they turned to their Lord with hearts wide open. They did not demand deliverance or bargain with fate. Their prayer was simple. They asked for mercy. They asked for guidance. They asked for their affair to be made right. These were not the words of people clinging to power or privilege. These were the words of those who had given up control and placed their trust entirely in the one who sees all things. What they had done was more than physical migration. It was a spiritual leap. They had left behind the illusion of control, the security of routine, and the approval of their peers. They had chosen the loneliness of truth over the companionship of falsehood. The cave, though barren, became a sanctuary, not because of its walls, but because of what happened within them. It became a place of surrender, of faith made manifest in stillness. There was no heroism in the conventional sense, no swords drawn, no speeches delivered. Only young men curled in the darkness, whispering prayers and surrendering to sleep. That sleep was not ordinary. It was not a rest taken after exhaustion, nor a pause before new plans. It was a miracle. It was the response to their prayer, the mercy they had asked for, sent not in the form of escape or conquest, but in the form of divine suspension. The sleep came upon them gently, and yet it carried with it the power of centuries. Their limbs relaxed, their breath slowed, and the rhythm of their hearts matched the silence around them. Outside the cave, time continued. Kings rose and fell. Cities were built and destroyed. Languages changed. Customs shifted, and generations passed without a whisper of their names. But inside the cave, they remained untouched. The sun rose and set, but it did not disturb them. The winds howled and the seasons turned, but they remained as they were. In that slumber, Allah preserved their bodies and souls. Their very being became a sign, not only for those who would find them in the future, but for every soul who would read their story and wonder at the power of faith. They did not wake each morning to reassess their plan. They did not worry about survival. Their part in the story was complete for now. They had believed, they had acted, and now they rested in the care of the one who had watched over them from the beginning. There is something deeply moving about the idea that sometimes the greatest act of faith is not action but stillness. The young men did not try to control the outcome. They did not devise elaborate strategies for reclaiming their city or reforming their people. They simply withdrew, prayed, and allowed the hand of God to take over. In doing so, they remind us that the path of belief is not always one of visible motion. It is not always marked by dramatic battles or public victories. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is hidden. And sometimes it takes place in the dark, where no one sees, and yet the heavens are fully aware. The cave became their resting place, not only physically but spiritually. It was there that they were shielded from the tyranny of disbelief, protected not by walls but by the mercy of God. It was there that they became a sign, preserved for a generation that would not even recognize the world from which they had fled. Their journey into the cave was not the end of their story, but it was the moment that defined it. It was the turning point where belief became action, where faith became a sanctuary, and where divine wisdom unfolded beyond the limits of human understanding. As they slept, the world moved on. The city they left may have crumbled or been transformed. The people who had mocked them grew old and died. But in the silence of the cave, faith endured. In their stillness, a miracle was planted, and in the moment they closed their eyes, they became part of something eternal. Inside the cave, time ceased to be what the young men had always known it to be. In the world they left behind, time was measured by the rising and setting of the sun, by the length of shadows stretching across city streets, by the sounds of markets opening and closing. But in the cave there were no clocks, no voices, no movement to track the hours. There was only stillness, and within that stillness, the quiet decree of the one who commands all things. Their bodies lay on stone, their chests slowly rising and falling, their limbs untouched by decay or discomfort. It was not a sleep that any physician or scholar could explain, for it was not rooted in biology or exhaustion. It was a divine sleep, imposed by mercy, sustained by power, and framed entirely outside the boundaries of human understanding. The Qur'an tells us that they remained in that state for 309 years. This was not an arbitrary number, but one that speaks to the nature of divine timing. From a worldly perspective, 3 centuries represent the rise and fall of dynasties, the birth and death of languages, the reconfiguration of entire civilizations. Empires expand and collapse, cultures evolve, rulers ascend and fade into oblivion. Yet for those in the cave, not a second of that history brushed against their skin. They slept through it all, their eyes shielded from the harshness of sunlight, their bodies turned from side to side as if by invisible hands to preserve them in their place. It was not simply a matter of being untouched by time, but of being actively preserved within it. Allah did not forget them. On the contrary, they were placed in a pause so complete, so deliberate, that it became its own miracle. From the outside, the cave might have appeared ordinary, Its stones bore the scars of wind and weather. Its entrance was partially shaded, and the animals that wandered nearby would have paid it little attention. But within its darkness, the unseen was at work. The sun, in its rising and setting, was subtly directed to pass by without disturbing their rest. Its light never struck them directly, as if it, too, obeyed the command of the one who had chosen to guard these young souls. The air inside the cave remained just so, never too cold nor too warm, and the silence was complete, broken only by the quiet stirrings of breath. There was no pain in their rest, no hunger, no thirst, no awareness of time's passing. In the Qur'an, Allah describes how He turned them from one side to another, ensuring that their bodies would not suffer the indignities of time. Even their dog remained at the entrance of the cave, its forelegs stretched out in a pose of eternal vigilance, as if keeping watch over its companions. The faithful animal, though it too had no understanding of what was taking place, had been chosen to share in their retreat, and so it, too, became part of the miracle. What is perhaps most profound about this divine suspension is the way it reveals the power of God over every dimension of existence. Human beings are bound by time. They wake and sleep, they grow and age, they remember and forget. Time is the framework in which they understand their lives, and it often feels like both a gift and a burden. Yet here, Allah demonstrates that time itself is a creation, subject to His will. He can stretch it, compress it, stop it entirely. What seems impossible to human understanding is effortless to Him. The young men who fled their city for the sake of truth did not know what would happen next. They only knew they had entrusted their lives to the Lord of all. In return, they were granted protection that no fortress could provide, preservation that no physician could administer, and significance that no worldly fame could match. Their sleep was not an escape from reality but a preparation for something far greater. They had passed a test of belief by choosing exile over compromise. Now, through the passage of 3 centuries, they would become a sign for others, a living proof that Allah aids those who turn to Him with sincerity. They had no idea that the city they once fled would one day become a place where their story would be honored, their names spoken with reverence, and their stance remembered as a model of steadfast faith. While they slept, the world outside moved on. The tyrant who had once ruled with arrogance was long gone. The people who mocked and persecuted them had returned to dust. New generations had been born, and in time, the city itself had transformed. Belief in the one God, which had once been a cause for persecution, had now found acceptance among the people. The very truth for which the youths had suffered was now recognized by the society that once rejected it, and yet they knew none of this. In the stillness of the cave, they remained untouched by history, preserved like a sacred secret waiting to be revealed. Their slumber carries with it another lesson as well, one that speaks to the heart of patience. In our daily lives, we often long for immediate results, quick answers, fast victories. We want our efforts to be rewarded now, for our truths to be accepted swiftly, for justice to arrive without delay. But Allah teaches through their story that sometimes, the most profound effects of sincerity are hidden from the eyes of those who act. The young men did not live to see their triumph. They did not walk again among the people to witness their vindication. Yet their choice, made in obscurity and silence, became a turning point for generations to come. It reminds us that when deeds are done for Allah alone, their impact is never lost, even if it takes centuries to unfold. This miraculous sleep, lasting over 300 years, is not merely a curiosity of the past. It is a symbol, one that invites every believer to consider the nature of trust, the patience required for real transformation, and the mercy that can descend in forms we cannot predict. Sometimes, rest is not a sign of defeat, but of divine preservation. Sometimes, the pause is more powerful than the motion. In the cave, surrounded by stone and silence, a handful of young men were chosen to bear witness to the truth by doing nothing at all, except to surrender. Their sleep was not an end, but an interval, and within it, Allah wrote a chapter that would outlive empires. When the time came for them to awaken, it was not by accident. It was not due to hunger or noise or the turning of seasons. It was because the one who had placed them in sleep had now decreed that the world was ready to see them again. And so, as the sun rose once more, its light spilling across the stones of the cave, the miracle of awakening began. Their eyes opened not just to a new day, but to a new world, one that bore no resemblance to the one they had left behind. The sleepers had become signs. The forgotten had become remembered. And the cave, once a place of hiding, had become the stage of revelation. When the young men awoke, it was not with the slow stirrings of a long night's rest. It was sudden, as if the veil of sleep had been lifted in an instant, and they returned to themselves as naturally as they had once closed their eyes. Their limbs, miraculously preserved, bore no trace of decay or weakness. Their voices, when they spoke, carried no tremble of time. To them, it had been a short slumber. A day, or perhaps part of a day. The cave around them had not changed. Its walls were as cold and familiar as when they had entered, and the air still held the same quiet scent of stone and earth. There was no indication that the world outside had spun through centuries in their absence. They sat together, blinking in the dim light that filtered through the narrow opening of the cave, and began to speak to one another with the ease of men who believed they had simply dozed off after a long journey. But hunger soon reminded them of their needs. Though time had stood still around them, their bodies felt the pangs of emptiness, and they knew they would need food. The quiet serenity of the cave gave way to the practical question of how to find nourishment without attracting the attention of those who might still seek to harm them. Their memories of the city had not faded. They remembered the hostility, the idolatry, the eyes that watched for dissent. One of them volunteered to go into the town, and his companions reminded him to be cautious, to remain discreet, and above all, not to let anyone know who they were. They feared the same world they had left, unaware that that world no longer existed. As he made his way down the hills and toward the outskirts of the city, he carried with him a coin from their time. It was an old coin, minted under the authority of the tyrant they had fled, bearing the markings and symbols of a regime that had long since vanished. The path he walked was both familiar and strange. The terrain had not changed drastically, but there were new buildings, unfamiliar signs, and faces he did not recognize. As he stepped into the marketplace, the differences became too numerous to ignore. The speech of the people had shifted. Their clothing was different. Their manners were foreign. And most astonishing of all, they openly spoke of belief in the one God. He tried to remain calm, approaching a merchant to buy some food. When he handed over the coin, the merchant held it up in confusion. The coin was not just old, it was impossibly old. It bore the face of a ruler who, in their records, had died centuries before. Whispers began to rise among the people. Where had this young man come from? How had he come into possession of something that belonged to a long-forgotten time? His accent, his manner of dress, his guarded way of speaking, everything about him felt out of place. People began to gather, drawn by curiosity and the scent of a miracle. The young man, overwhelmed by the crowd, began to explain. Not with arrogance or pride, but with the simple honesty of one who had nothing to hide. He told them that he and his companions had fled persecution and sought refuge in a cave. They had slept, and when they awoke, they had thought only a short time had passed. The people were astonished. Scholars and leaders were summoned, and the mystery only deepened. His story matched no known account. His appearance bore no signs of myth or fabrication. He was not a ghost or a madman. He was flesh and blood, sincere in his words and firm in his conviction. As the realization spread that these were the very youths whose tale had been passed down through generations as a legend, awe gripped the city. What had once been spoken of as a fable had now come to life. The people began to understand that this was not a mere coincidence or a case of mistaken identity. It was a sign from God. For the young men, the world they had once known had been replaced by one they had never imagined. The idols were gone. The society that had once rejected them now honored the very truth for which they had been cast out. Belief in the one God had not only survived but flourished. The persecution they had once feared had faded into memory. Their faith had endured beyond the lifespans of tyrants, outlasted palaces, and triumphed over the passing of centuries. They had not fought wars, led armies, or ruled over empires. Yet their silent act of withdrawal, their retreat into the cave, had become a story so powerful that time itself bowed to its weight. The city now embraced them, not as fugitives but as miracles. The people wanted to honor them, to preserve their memory. Some proposed erecting a structure at the site of the cave, not to worship them, but to mark the place where such a wonder had occurred. Their presence had become a living proof of the unseen. What they had done in secret was now being celebrated in public. What they had sacrificed in youth had been returned to them in full measure, though in a way they had never expected. They had become a bridge between eras, a sign that belief is not bound by time, and that truth, even when buried, will rise again. For the young men, this recognition was not a cause for pride but for humility. They had acted for the sake of God, not for the sake of legacy. Their hearts remained sincere, and their eyes were still turned toward the one who had guided and protected them. They did not seek to lead the people or bask in the attention. Their role had already been fulfilled. Their awakening was not a beginning, but a conclusion, a reminder that God does not forget those who believe in Him, and that patience is not lost in the folds of time. The moment of awakening was a moment of reunion not only with the world but with the divine truth they had always clung to. It proved that Allah is never absent, never unaware, and never distant from His servants. He preserves what He wills, in ways no mind can predict. He changes the hearts of people and transforms entire societies. What had once been a land of idols had become a place of monotheism. What had once hunted the believers now welcomed them. And all of this had occurred without a single act of rebellion, only through the power of faith and the mercy of God. In the end, their awakening was not for their benefit alone. It was for the generations to come. It was for those who would one day doubt whether God hears the cries of the oppressed. It was for those who would wonder whether belief has any lasting strength in a world consumed by change. It was for the hearts that tremble in the face of tyranny, unsure whether sacrifice is worth the cost. To all of them, the sleepers of the cave offered an answer. Yes, belief matters. Yes, sacrifice is seen. Yes, truth survives. And so, the world that had forgotten them now remembered. Their story was etched into the consciousness of a new time. They had gone into the cave as nameless youths. They emerged as signs. Not of myth, but of living faith. Not of legend, but of a reality shaped by the will of the most merciful. The cave had not just been a shelter from harm. It had been a cradle for a miracle, and from its darkness, a light had emerged that would never fade. As the truth of the young men's story settled upon the hearts of the people, it became clear that something extraordinary had unfolded. What had once been dismissed as a tale from distant memory now stood before them as living reality. The people who had listened to stories of the cave as though they were fables handed down by their elders now saw those very figures standing among them, breathing and speaking. The awe that filled the city was not a mere fascination with the supernatural. It was a reverence born from the recognition that Allah's promise always unfolds, and that sincere belief, no matter how hidden or forgotten, never disappears from His sight. News spread rapidly through the streets. The scholars were the first to approach with caution, carrying scrolls and parchments that contained references to a group of young believers from long ago. These were records passed down over generations, often debated in religious gatherings, usually spoken of with wonder and skepticism, but now those once abstract names had faces. The style of their clothing, the dialect of their speech, and the ancient coin they had offered in the marketplace all stood as witnesses to their truth. They were not impostors. They were not madmen. They were exactly who they claimed to be. The young believers who had fled the city's oppression, chosen seclusion over compromise, and slept under God's mercy while time quietly reshaped the world. The rulers of the land, more inclined to believe in the unseen than their predecessors, welcomed this divine sign with humility. They made no effort to use the youths for power or fame. Instead, they stepped back in awe. They recognized that this moment was not a political opportunity but a spiritual turning point. The young men were not seen as mere individuals but as signs sent by God. Their emergence reminded the people that Allah protects those who believe in Him, even when the world forgets them. Their reappearance was like a stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples of their faith stirring hearts across generations. In response to the miracle, the people began to ask how they might preserve this moment for future generations. They feared that time would once again erode the memory of what had happened, that skepticism would grow in the absence of proof. And so it was decided that the cave would be honored, not as a place of worship, but as a memorial to God's power and a reminder of the human capacity for unwavering belief. A structure was proposed, something simple yet dignified, to be built near the cave. Its purpose would be to shelter the site and allow others to come and reflect. It was not to become a shrine, but a place of remembrance. People needed to know that such a story was not confined to books. It had occurred in their land, among real people, through the will of the one who never sleeps nor forgets. The young men themselves, having fulfilled their purpose, did not seek to remain in the world they had awakened to. They did not ask for comfort, nor did they desire to be celebrated. They had lived their lives for God, and had found peace in His protection. Now that the truth had been made clear, there was nothing left for them to do. Their hearts were content. Their faith had outlasted tyranny. Their test had become a legacy. The Qur'an does not detail their final moments, but many scholars and narrations suggest that after their story had been made known, they returned to the cave and passed away in peace, reunited with their Lord. Their legacy, however, continued to grow. In the days and years that followed, people came from far and wide to see the place where the miracle had taken place. They did not come to seek blessing from the stones or to venerate the sleepers themselves, but to strengthen their own belief. The cave became a symbol, a physical testimony to the power of sincere intention. People who struggled with faith would walk its path and remember that belief is not measured by numbers or by victory in the moment. It is measured by truth, by steadfastness, and by the willingness to place one's trust entirely in God. The youth who had once hidden from society now stood as examples for all of it. Their silence had spoken louder than any proclamation. Their absence from the world had done more to awaken hearts than any debate or sermon. And all of it had come from one decision: to live in a way that honored their Creator, even if it cost them everything. Their names are not mentioned in the Qur'an, and perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Their significance lies not in their personal identity but in their collective devotion. They remind every believer that you do not have to be known by the world to be honored by Allah. What matters is the purity of one's intention, the clarity of one's faith, and the courage to act on both when the world demands compromise. As generations passed, the story of the people of the cave continued to be told. It became a part of Friday sermons, a passage to be memorized and reflected upon. It reminded people that divine protection is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it comes in the form of delay, of obscurity, of long pauses that test our patience and trust. But when it does come, it is perfect in its timing and unmatched in its wisdom. People who visited the cave would often bring their children, pointing to the stones and retelling the story not just as an event of the past but as a guide for the present. Fathers would remind their sons of the courage it takes to hold on to truth when everyone around you lets go. Mothers would speak to their daughters about the strength found in silence, in knowing when to retreat from a world that no longer shares your values. Elders would speak of the long sleep not as a magical tale, but as a living sign that belief does not die even when it disappears from view. In this way, the legacy of the young men extended far beyond their own lives. They had intended only to protect their faith. They had not set out to change the world. But in choosing what was right, they changed more than they ever could have imagined. Their story entered hearts, crossed borders, and became a permanent part of revelation, recited by millions of tongues every week, contemplated by seekers of truth in every corner of the world. What remains most profound about their story is the gentleness of its unfolding. There was no spectacle, no fire from the sky or thunder in the earth. Just a group of young men walking away from what was false, stepping into a dark cave, and placing their lives in the hands of the one who never abandons his servants. That single act, quiet and resolute, became the seed of a miracle that continues to bloom with every generation that reads their story and finds in it the courage to believe. The cave that sheltered the young believers was no grand palace, no fortress built with high walls or guarded by men. It was a hollow in the side of a hill, a place without luxury or protection in any worldly sense. Yet it became one of the most sacred and meaningful symbols in the history of faith. Its walls heard no cries of rebellion, no speeches of defiance, but they held within them the pure silence of submission and the unwavering resolve of hearts that chose their Lord over their comfort. The cave, in all its simplicity, was transformed by what it represented: a quiet retreat for the soul, a sanctuary of belief, and a place where time bowed before the will of the Almighty. In its dark and narrow interior, the cave became a space where the physical world lost its grip. The young men had entered with the weight of fear, the sting of rejection, and the pain of separation still fresh upon them. They had walked away from the city not in search of ease but in search of truth. The cave did not offer food, safety, or any of the things the human body craves. What it offered instead was separation from the noise, the falsehood, and the overwhelming pressure to conform. In that separation, they found room to breathe, to reflect, to surrender completely. It was not the darkness of the cave that mattered, but the light they carried within their hearts. To enter a cave is to accept isolation. It is to step into a place where the world can no longer reach you, where the sounds of society are muffled and where the distractions of daily life fall silent. For many, such a place would provoke fear. It would bring unease and discomfort. Yet for those whose hearts are attached to the eternal, such seclusion becomes a mercy. The Prophet Muhammad himself sought solitude in a cave before the revelation began. In the darkness of Hira, he would sit alone, far from the idols and corruption of Mecca, contemplating the signs of creation and searching for guidance. The cave became a place of revelation, of beginning, and of communion with the unseen. In that stillness, truth descended, and the course of human history shifted forever. The cave of the young men carried that same sacred weight. Though no words of revelation came to them within its stone walls, what they lived was a revelation in itself. Their choice to retreat for the sake of preserving faith was a declaration far louder than any proclamation. It was a statement that belief is worth leaving the world behind for, that the soul is nourished not by luxury but by connection to the Creator. Their cave, though small and unadorned, became a house of remembrance, a space where the angels watched and where the mercy of God wrapped around them like a cloak. To the believer, the idea of retreat is not foreign. In times of great trial, the prophets would often withdraw, not out of fear, but out of reflection. When Musa was called to the mount, he left the people behind. When Yunus found himself in the belly of the whale, it became a forced seclusion, one that led to repentance and renewal. Even Miriam, when she received the glad tidings of Isa, was in a place apart from the people. Again and again, the sacred texts show that solitude is not absence but presence. It is not a void but a vessel, where the distractions of the world are stripped away and only the essential remains. In that raw, quiet space, the voice of the soul becomes clearer, and the whispers of truth grow louder. The modern world often does not value seclusion. It prizes visibility, connectivity, and constant motion. Silence is treated as a void to be filled rather than a space to be honored. Yet the story of the cave stands as a timeless reminder that there is power in retreat. There is wisdom in withdrawing from what harms the heart, even if only temporarily. The believer does not isolate for the sake of abandoning the world, but to return to it with clearer vision and stronger purpose. Seclusion becomes a tool, not of escape, but of spiritual repair. In the stillness, one remembers who they are and to whom they belong. For the young men, the cave became their teacher. It taught them the value of patience, the beauty of divine timing, and the reality that Allah's care can come in the most unexpected forms. They entered it with uncertainty, perhaps even fear, and they remained in it under the protection of the most merciful. Their sleep was not only physical. It was a complete surrender of their situation, their outcome, and their legacy. They placed all of it in the hands of their Lord, and the cave became the cradle of their trust. To reflect on their story is to reflect on the role of solitude in the life of a believer. Not every cave is made of stone. Sometimes it is found in the quiet corner of a room where one bows their head in prayer. Sometimes it is in the moment before dawn, when the world still sleeps and the sky begins to lighten with mercy. Sometimes it is the decision to turn off the noise, to close the door to distractions, and to sit with the Qur'an, with the heart, with the remembrance of God. These modern caves are just as important, just as transformative. They do not require mountains or exile. They require intention and sincerity. The lesson of the cave is not only about survival, it is about the journey inward, about finding a space where the soul can breathe, where the clutter of the world can be cleared away. It is about acknowledging that faith is sometimes best nourished in silence, away from the applause and the expectations of others. The young men did not seek fame. They sought safety for their belief. Et noti avar, et did bises. What they were given was something far greater. They were granted a place in the divine narrative, their story etched into revelation, their names known to God even if forgotten by men. Their cave was not a destination but a transition. It marked the point at which they moved from being young men pressured by society to believers preserved by the Most High. It was the place where they let go of fear and found the serenity of trust. In its darkness, they were enveloped in light. In its silence, they were surrounded by remembrance. And in their stillness, they were transformed. Every believer who reads their story is invited to find their own cave, to ask what must be left behind and what silence must be embraced in order to hear the truth more clearly. The world is loud, and its demands are constant. But in the example of the people of the cave, there is a call to retreat, not forever, but long enough to reconnect. Long enough to remember that faith is not dependent on visibility or approval, but on sincerity and surrender. And so, the cave remains not just a place in history, but a symbol in the soul. It calls quietly to those who seek meaning, who are tired of noise, who long for nearness to the one who never turns away. The young men entered it with faith and emerged as a sign. They did not know they would be remembered. They only knew they could not betray what they believed. That alone was enough. That alone made the cave more sacred than any palace. That alone made their silence echo through the ages. The youth who took shelter in the cave were not scholars, leaders, or prophets. They were ordinary young men who carried within themselves an extraordinary clarity. Their story begins with conviction, not built upon years of learning or a lineage of spiritual giants, but born in hearts that refused to bow to what was false. In a world where the truth was unpopular and dangerous, these young men chose to believe not only with their tongues but with their lives. They did not merely speak about monotheism. They walked away from everything that opposed it. Their courage was not measured by outward strength but by their readiness to lose status, wealth, family, and future in order to remain loyal to their Creator. Youth is often thought of as a time of confusion, rebellion, and weakness. Many dismiss the young, assuming they lack wisdom or resolve. But history is full of moments where the young have stood taller than their years would suggest. The men of the cave were such individuals. While others compromised, they questioned. While others conformed, they resisted. And while others built comfort within systems of disbelief, they walked away into uncertainty. Their choice was not made with fanfare. It was not celebrated by those around them. It was a quiet decision, made in the depth of the heart, then acted upon with full awareness of the cost. It is easy to be strong when one is surrounded by support, when belief is the norm, and when speaking the truth carries no risk. The test of faith is when one must stand alone, when doing the right thing invites ridicule, punishment, or isolation. These young men faced such a test. They lived in a society where idolatry was not only widespread but enforced by authority. Public rituals glorified false gods, and anyone who refused to participate risked more than just social scorn. There was real danger, real threat, and in the midst of this, They chose each other. One by one, their hearts recognized the same truth. They found in each other a reflection of what was stirring in their souls. Their unity was a gift. Though the Qur'an leaves their names and exact number uncertain, it emphasizes their companionship. They did not stand alone. They stood together, not as a crowd, but as a small circle of sincerity. In each other, they found strength. In each other, they found confirmation that they were not mad, not lost, not strange. They were believers, and their faith was real. Together, they made their way to the cave. Together, they faced hunger, fear, and the possibility of death. Their bond was not based on shared interests or background. It was rooted in shared purpose. They wanted to preserve their belief, even if the cost was everything else. The story invites us to consider the value of righteous companionship. In moments of doubt or pressure, the presence of a like-minded friend can be the difference between holding on and giving up. The young men supported one another, reminded one another, and carried each other through the hardest moment of their lives. They could have scattered, hiding separately, trying to survive in secret. But instead, they chose to move as one. That unity gave them not only practical support but spiritual resilience. Together, they prayed. Together, they entered the cave. And together they were protected. Their age was not a barrier to wisdom. Their youth was not a sign of weakness. It was the very reason their story shines so brightly. Young people are often deeply aware of the contradictions around them. They feel hypocrisy strongly. They see injustice clearly. And if their hearts are sincere, they act with courage that surprises those around them. The Quran's emphasis on their youth is a reminder that righteousness is not delayed until old age. It is not something to be postponed until life has settled. Faith can burn bright in the hearts of the young, and when it does, it lights the way for others. Their role as examples is not limited to their time. Every generation faces its own trials. Disbelief takes many forms. Sometimes it is loud and oppressive, as it was in their city. Sometimes it is subtle and seductive, cloaked in distraction or materialism. In every case, the believer must decide what they will accept and what they will walk away from. The young men of the cave did not wait for society to change. They did not compromise in hopes of gradual reform. They recognized that their souls were in danger, and they chose to protect them, even if it meant becoming strangers. That willingness to be seen as strange is one of the most powerful aspects of their example. They did not fear standing apart. They did not fear being misunderstood. They feared only the loss of their connection with their Lord. In doing so, they fulfilled what the Prophet Muhammad would later describe when he said that Islam began as something strange and would return to being strange, and that glad tidings belong to those who are seen as strangers for the sake of truth. These young men lived that reality centuries before that hadith was spoken. They embraced the role of the stranger, and in that role, they found divine nearness. Their example offers a blueprint for believers today. In a world that often rewards compromise and punishes conviction, their story reminds us that truth is not determined by popularity. Righteousness is not measured by numbers, and faith is not sustained by comfort. It is tested in hardship, refined in solitude, and preserved through trust. The cave is no longer a place to flee to in the physical sense, but the decision it represents remains. Every believer must find their cave, their place of withdrawal from what threatens their soul. Sometimes that cave is a decision to step away from certain friendships. Sometimes it is choosing not to participate in an event or habit that weakens belief. Sometimes it is simply the internal stance of holding on to what is right, even when no one else does. Their courage was not loud. They did not shout or provoke. They simply walked away. But in that quiet act, they declared more than words ever could. They declared that belief is worth sacrifice, that truth is worth discomfort, that God is worth more than the approval of the world. And because of that, they were honored, not only in their own time, but in revelation. Their story was chosen by Allah to be preserved in the Qur'an, recited in every corner of the earth, remembered by hearts seeking courage. In them we see that the strength of youth lies not in rebellion for its own sake, but in a rebellion against falsehood. We see that unity among the sincere carries more weight than popularity among the misguided. And we see that sometimes the most transformative acts come from those whom the world has overlooked. Their story is not distant, it is near. It calls to every heart that struggles to hold on, that wonders if belief is still possible in a world so loud. It answers with certainty. Yes, it is possible. Yes, it is worth it. Yes, even now, even here, even with all the pressures and distractions, a heart can still choose truth. And in choosing it, that heart joins a legacy that began in a cave, carried by young believers who trusted in God and found in Him everything they needed. The story of the young men in the cave carries within it a message that stretches far beyond the confines of its time. It is not limited to a particular age, nor is it bound to the land in which it occurred. It is a story rooted in the human experience of trial, of belief standing firm in the face of adversity, and of truth outlasting falsehood. Every era faces its own challenges, and though the nature of those challenges may change in form, the essence remains the same. The test of faith, the lure of the world, the pressures to conform, and the temptation to trade conviction for comfort are timeless struggles. The youth who fled their city did not face what we face today, but they faced what lies at the heart of every generation's test, whether to stay true to what is right when it costs something. Their trial was one of belief in the face of tyranny. Their society did not merely promote falsehood, it demanded obedience to it. The young men had to choose between bowing to that falsehood or walking away with nothing but their faith. That decision was not romantic. It was not made with the assurance of safety or reward. It was made in the silence of the soul, in that sacred place where a person must decide what they will live for. The power of their story lies in its recognition that trials are not only external, they begin inside. Before the ruler condemned them, before the people turned against them, there was a storm within. That storm was the pull of doubt, the fear of isolation, the pain of leaving behind the known. But they chose to ride that storm instead of letting it carry them toward compromise. They trusted that even if the world forgot them, their Lord would not. Every age brings with it new forms of pressure. In some parts of the world, belief is still met with open hostility, where speaking the truth can lead to imprisonment or death. In others, the challenge is quieter, more subtle, but no less dangerous. Belief may not be banned, but it is mocked. It may not cost a person their life, but it may cost them their reputation, their friendships, their opportunities. The test comes wrapped in different clothing, but the heart of it is the same. Will you stand firm, or will you bend? Surah Al-Kahf offers guidance not just through the story of the cave, but through the collection of stories that surround it. Each narrative speaks to a different kind of trial. The owner of the two gardens is tested by wealth and pride, believing his success is permanent and earned by his own hand. Musa is tested through his encounter with Khidr, facing the limits of his knowledge and the need to trust divine wisdom even when he does not understand it. Dhul Qarnayn is tested with power and how he chooses to use it, whether to dominate or to protect. These stories are not random. They are placed together with purpose, creating a map of the most common trials that touch human life. The youth of the cave represent the trial of faith, especially in youth when the world feels overwhelming and conviction is often challenged by peer pressure, ambition, and desire. The man of the two gardens represents the trial of material wealth, a temptation that blinds the heart to the reality of life's impermanence. Musa and Khidr show us the test of knowledge, when even the most learned must bow to the mystery of God's plan. Dhul Qarnayn reminds us that power is not evil in itself, but its righteousness depends on the one who wields it, and for what purpose. When read together, these stories build a picture of a complete believer, someone who must navigate the pull of this world, the arrogance of intellect, the weight of leadership, and the fire of trial. None of us are tested in just one way. Life brings with it seasons of ease and hardship, of influence and obscurity, of clarity and confusion. The lesson of Surah Al-Kahf is not to run from these trials, but to meet them with the same heart the youth carried into the cave, a heart that knows its Lord and chooses Him over everything else. One of the most profound aspects of their story is how Allah responded. He did not grant them victory through force or allow them to return to the city and lead a movement of reform. He granted them rest. He placed them in sleep, away from the world, and changed the world without their intervention. This speaks to the quiet power of sincerity. Sometimes, the most significant transformations are not made by those in the spotlight, but by those who are steadfast in private. A single act of truth, done for God alone, can ripple through generations. The youth did not seek to be remembered. They only sought to be faithful. Yet Allah preserved their story and elevated it, making them examples for all time. The tests we face today may not lead us to caves in the literal sense, but they do demand similar choices. We are constantly faced with decisions that test our integrity, our patience, our trust. Do we stay honest when it is easier to lie? Do we hold to prayer when our schedules are full? Do we speak up when truth is unpopular? Do we remain generous when the world encourages us to hoard? Each of these choices is a test. Each is a moment where the heart is measured. What makes the trial of faith particularly challenging is that it often feels invisible. There is no crowd to cheer us on when we make the right choice. There is no immediate reward for turning away from temptation. Sometimes, it feels like nothing changes at all, but the story of the cave reminds us that Allah sees what no one else does. He knows the heart that wrestles in secret. He knows the effort it takes to walk away from what is wrong, and He knows how to honor that struggle in ways we cannot imagine. This is why the recitation of Surah Al-Kahf is encouraged every Friday. It is not just about memorizing verses or following a ritual. It is a weekly reminder. A reminder that this life is a series of trials, and that belief is not meant to be passive. It is meant to be lived, protected, and renewed. Every time we read it, we are invited to reflect on where we stand. Are we holding firm like the youth in the cave? Are we forgetting the source of our blessings like the man with the 2 gardens? Are we humble enough to admit what we do not understand, like Musa had to learn? Are we using our power, influence, and knowledge for the good of others, like Dhul Qarnayn? The cave is not just a story, it is a mirror. It shows us who we are and who we might become. It reminds us that the trials of faith are not relics of the past but living realities, and it offers hope. Hope that even if the world forgets, even if our efforts go unseen, even if we must walk alone, Allah remains, watching, guiding, preserving, elevating. In every trial, there is a choice, and in every choice made for the sake of God, there is reward. The youth of the cave chose. They chose with courage, with sincerity, with trust. And their choice became a timeless sign that belief does not die. It waits, it rests, it rises again. Every story has its end, but the story of the cave lingers far beyond its final moment. It does not fade when the young men return to their rest. It does not close when the people build a place of remembrance at the site where the miracle occurred. Instead, the story continues in the hearts of those who read it, generation after generation, each finding within its quiet lines a mirror of their own journey. The cave is not only a place on a map or a moment in time, it becomes a part of the believer's soul, a symbol of the inward retreat, a space of safety when the world feels too heavy to bear. In the stillness of that cave, something eternal was written. It was not written in stone, nor in ink, but in the record of God's mercy. The young men did not know their story would reach the ears of strangers centuries later. They did not act with an audience in mind. They did not preserve their faith so they would be remembered. They did so because they believed in their Lord. That alone was enough. Yet from their sincerity came a story that has outlived kings and nations. It continues to be recited on the tongues of the faithful, shaping the thoughts of those who seek to live with conviction in a world full of doubt. The cave invites every believer to ask themselves what they are holding on to and what they are willing to let go. It calls the heart to examine where it stands when belief is not easy, when truth is lonely, and when surrender costs more than comfort. The young men of the cave did not make their choice because they were forced. They were not cornered by circumstance. They saw the falsehood around them, felt the emptiness of the idols, and chose instead the quiet dignity of faith. Their walk toward the cave was not only a physical journey, it was a declaration that what is true deserves loyalty even when no one else sees it. For the believer today, the cave may not be carved into stone, but it still exists. It may take the form of solitude, a moment of retreat from the pressures that push against faith. It may be found in prayer before dawn when the world is still and the heart is awake. It may be the decision to stay honest in a dishonest world, or to speak a gentle truth when silence is easier. These are the caves of the heart, the places where faith is tested and affirmed. They are not loud, they are not celebrated, but within them, something sacred grows. The cave reminds us that faith is not always loud or visible. It does not always roar or shine. Sometimes it rests in stillness. Sometimes it waits in the dark. And even then, it is alive. The young men were hidden for over 3 centuries. In that time, no one saw them. No one praised them. Yet Allah saw them, guarded them, and preserved them not only in body but in legacy. What they chose in secret became a sign for all people. It is a promise that Allah does not forget the sincere, even if the world does. Every believer who has ever felt unseen, forgotten, or isolated in their pursuit of truth finds in their story the assurance that nothing done for the sake of Allah is ever lost. Their awakening was brief. They rose into a world they could barely recognize. They spoke a truth that startled those around them, and then their role was complete. They returned to rest, their mission fulfilled. They were not called to build a new city, to lead a movement, or to shape policy. They were called to believe, to flee, to trust. That was enough. That was all. In that simplicity lies one of the greatest truths of the story. We are not all called to lead or to speak loudly, but we are all called to be sincere. We are all called to choose God when the world calls us to forget Him. Their legacy is not built on fame or grandeur. It is built on surrender. It is built on that moment of walking away, of turning their backs on a system that demanded compromise, and instead facing the unknown with only faith as their companion. They did not know where they were going. They only knew why they were leaving, and because they left for Allah, He carried them forward. He held them in time, outside of time, beyond the reach of history, until the moment arrived when their story would be needed. Today, when hearts are tired and faith feels like a battle, their story arrives again, not as a fable or a bedtime tale, but as a living sign. Their cave becomes the metaphor we return to. When life becomes too loud, we remember the cave. When conviction feels too costly, we remember the cave. When standing alone feels unbearable, we remember the cave. It is not a place of escape, but of preservation, not a place of weakness, but of strength. The young men did not run in fear. They retreated with purpose. They left behind a world that had no room for their belief, and found in the silence of the cave a space where truth could breathe. The Qur'an leaves parts of their story unspoken. Their names are not given. Their exact number is not fixed. The length of their sleep is spoken in both lunar and solar years, leaving room for reflection. These silences are not accidents. They invite us to enter the story ourselves, to ask where we might have stood, to consider how we might respond when belief demands sacrifice. Their namelessness allows their story to belong to everyone. They are not distant figures locked in history. They are a reflection of every soul that chooses God when it would be easier not to. In the end, the story of the cave is a gift, a mercy wrapped in mystery, preserved by the most merciful to remind us that no act of faith goes unnoticed, that no heart turned toward truth is left without aid, that the tests of life, however long they last, are always seen by the one who created time itself. The young men entered the cave with uncertainty, but they were certain in their Lord. That certainty carried them across centuries. That trust became a beacon. Each Friday, as Surah Al-Kahf is recited around the world, their story is told again. And each time it is told, it lights a candle in the heart of someone who needed it. In that light, we see that the cave still stands, not in stone alone, but in spirit, waiting for the one who chooses to step into its shade, to sit with God in stillness, and to rise again with a heart more firm than before. The world may change, the trials may take new forms, but the test remains, and so does the promise. Those who seek their cave for the sake of Allah will never be left alone. The path may be narrow, the road steep, but the one who guided the sleepers of the cave still guides today. The cave may be silent, but its story still speaks. And in that story we find the courage to believe again,